Herzlich willkommen, meine Damen und Herren, zum Encounters-Programm hier in der Messe TRESOR 2017. Ich möchte Sie im Namen von Dorothee Schisser, vom Team TRESOR und mir, mein Name ist Quin, ich bin der Inhaber von Worldcraft, wo die Encounters präsentiert. Wir hatten in den letzten 4 Tagen über 30 Leute, die hier auf der Bühne waren und Einblicke in ihr Schaffen gaben, in ihre Tätigkeiten, aber auch in ihre Person. Und es war sehr spannend, wirklich zu hören, wie es eben auch die Geschichten, die dahinter waren.
Welcome to the last day of our Encounters program presented by Worldcraft. We are very happy that we had more than 30 artists, collectors, different influent people that came to speak in this on the stage for the 4 days. Now we are going to welcome 3 women which are done a group called Metal Project. There are 5 women in total, working all with different kind of metals, there are 3 generations of women, and I think this will be very interesting. Welcome Juliette Bigley, Rebecca de Quin, and Simone Hompel.
Zuerst will ich Ihnen gerne einen Film zeigen. Relax and listen. So thank you very much for coming. Warm welcome from the 3 of us. The other 2 had to go back to London. The film gives you a little insight into what it takes to make. It's a slightly different world of that when you go into an office and tap on a computer, although you can recognize that some of the noises have familiarity with the tic-tac in an office, the walking, the computer. Noises are quite important for this making, because it declares a rhythm that could be good or not so. So first of all, we are going to show you a number of images, but that comes later on. The understanding of our group is possibly more interesting to get across to you first. We are 5 independent makers, so we are not an organization. We have been approached by TRESOR to show here, and that's how we decided to take this endeavor on. we are showing on our table 5 different works that have different languages, and that comes across in the material, in the articulation of how to work with the material. The talk is between the 3 of us, so I hand over to you.
So I'm Rebecca, good afternoon. I'm just going to explain a little bit about the images. We've gathered together images from all of us, and they roughly fall into 3 categories, so that you'll find these all mixed up together. Some of them are images from the workshop, which give you an idea of the sort of tools that we use, the equipment, the methods, and the places. And you'll have gathered some of that from the film. Then we have a group of source images, so they're the images that we collect in order to help us generate our ideas for work. So the things that inspire us, the images that inspire us. And then the third group is the finished pieces. So you'll see these images going around in a loop in the background of the talk.
So matching the 3 types of images, we really wanted to have a discussion about 3 questions that for us are really important as makers. And what we hope to do is to give you a kind of window into what it's like to make some of the objects that you'll see at the show today. So the 3 questions are, what is making? Why do we make? And thirdly, what does it mean for us to make? How is it significant for us? And I'm going to open up a discussion on what making is. The easy, quick answer for us is that it's taking flat sheets of metal and forming them into objects, into some of the objects that you can see on our stand. But really making, I think for me certainly, is something much, much, much deeper than that. Not only is the objects that you see on the stand, the final objects, the end of a very long process, which starts with a kind of everyday observation of the world, goes through a processing in your head and also through various materials. But it also comes from a conversation with the material itself. Something that I've found fascinating about working in metal is we all work in the whole range of metals, in base metals like copper and brass, and also precious metals like silver and gold. And for me, each metal has its own character, a very definable character. Copper, for example, is, for me, quite a lazy metal. It's quite a sloppy metal. It leaves its clothes on the floor at the end of the day. Silver is a very gentle metal. It's a very easy metal to work with. It almost has a song to it. It has a musical quality to it. Not in terms of how it sounds when you hammer it or when you file it, but in terms of the quality of the metal and what it's like to work with. And so the act of making, for me, and I suspect for all of us, is a conversation with a piece. And where you start off thinking a piece is going, often that piece, once you've started on the form, once you've started making it, the piece begins to talk back to you. And some of them are really very opinionated indeed. And some of them won't go where you necessarily want them to. The other thing that I found very interesting, and particularly I share a workshop with Rebecca, and particularly sort of observing each other and observing how we make, has really made me realise the way that we make to our own characters. We make incredibly differently in terms of, right from those initial ideas. I'll let you talk about your own practice. but for me, making and designing and working on a piece is a very dynamic process. I work between paper, between plaster, I work quite quickly, and I work by sort of almost throwing different forms together, and through that kind of pieces emerge. So I'll maybe ask Rebecca to talk a little bit about what your making processes are.
So I think the things that we do are very similar. We both go through different stages. So we'll draw, we'll make models, and then the more, once we get onto the material itself, the processes are similar. It's just, I think that we work at quite different speeds. I think you work a lot faster than I do. You're very productive, and I'm very, very slow, and I'm not sure why that is. Well, I think I am actually. If you looked at the work on the table, Juliette's pieces have some. I think they really show the speed with which you work in terms of the finish. So there's some lovely kind of energetic finishes on her work that show
Dynamic.
Yes, that really show the sort of actions and the physicality of the pieces. So they're big pieces. Mine tend to be sort of, I think, kind of quieter and smaller, and maybe speak more of stillness. I don't know whether you'd agree with
Very
that.
precise, very precise.
But it's also that element of architectural that is referential in your work, that it has the casing or the juxtaposition to not only a material, also to a different shape and with a different reflection, and that needs a different kind of concentration or focus on making a decision, I presume.
Yes, I think that's probably true. Juliette says I plan everything out very carefully beforehand, and yes, I guess I do.
And Juliette is the lady who does all the spreadsheets. Someone is sitting in a glass house. I find it quite interesting that you say that silver sinks. For me, silver, and that may sound particular, peculiar to metalworkers, that we talk about the characteristics of metal. But for me, silver is something very democratic. It just doesn't do anything other than you do to it. So Rebecca polishes hers and sees the reflection. I wonder what's going in when you make that decision. But then you also put them in such a way that they reflect each other's surfaces, not the onlooker who comes in front of it. But when I tried to photograph your pieces, I always found myself in there.
Yes, that does make it difficult.
And I think it's possibly more fair to say for Juliette and myself that, certainly in my cases, I want you, the audience, to only see my shape and not check whether your tie or the spectacles or whatever. No, I deny you everything of reflection of yourself. So that's, I think, a different approach to using the metal, and therefore silver is democratic. If you don't look after it, it shows you're not looking after me, and it goes a little bit duller. And if you really, really don't look after it, it tells you that as well. It's coloration. Regarding the making, I don't know. I'm a really excellent dyslexic, so I go into it using a pair of scissors or a piercing saw and just cut something out, and need to see how it feels, how the third dimension is mapping itself out in front of me without a drawing. And thereafter I possibly go into drawing, but then drawing takes a very different notion of information. It's more the variance once I have the shape in front of me.
I think it's fair to say that for all of us, that kind of typical image of a designer beginning with a blank sheet of paper, working through designs and then making them, I think that's probably about as far away from the way that each of us make as you can find.
Yeah. Although it's fair to say that, for instance, Rebecca does work on a computer and maps things carefully out, so it involves that sort of control. But before you go onto the computer, what happened?
So a sketch would happen before that, and then I imagine the piece in more technical terms. So I would do a proper technical drawing, which I then sort of pick apart into a pattern.
And when is metal coming into the equation?
At the next stage. So I use the pattern on the metal.
Yeah.
So there is something, I think, about how we use the skills that we've generated in our sort of previous incarnations, our previous lives, how they really inform the shape of our individual practices. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about kind of your path in and why you make.
Yes, the why we make is an interesting topic that we've been talking about. I think all of us have a need to express ourselves in the world, as every human being does. But there are other very particular things that I think come into this. So background is an important thing, and one's genes. And for all three of us, our backgrounds and past experiences are quite different. So for me, I grew up in a very creative household with a father who was a sculptor and a teacher and worked in metal. And I couldn't help but see what he was doing and absorb some of that myself. Simone went to a school that had a real influence on your work. You didn't come from a family of makers, but it was more your schooling that influenced you. Can you say a little bit more about that?
I went to the boarding school because I'm an excellent dyslexic. The government school wanted to put me into a mental handicap school. Thank you very much. But I also said to my parents with 11, I know I want to do something in metal, and actually school is a waste of my time, until they explained very carefully that they may had to go to prison and I still had to do the school. That we found a better way of my time, which was then in the end that I could do a dual schooling system and did my apprenticeship as a blacksmith locksmith, as a Bauschlosser. And that really allowed me to go through these remaining 5-6 years of schooling. Thank you. It made it more palatable. And I think that makes things very different to expressing, because I started with 13, with 12, to use tools on a quite professional level.
But it wasn't just that for you, was it? You were at a very, what I would call a progressive school, which really helped you to think very freely about life and about the part that you play in your life.
Yeah.
You know, what you're able to do or what you're allowed to do.
Yes.
That sense of sort of free thinking.
Progressive and
really
not conservative, and questioning things, and questioning also why making or is making a good alternative to other problems in the world.
Yeah, the idea that you can express yourself through materials rather than through, say, writing or the more conventional processes that one learns at school, the maths and so on, I think is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
And then for Juliette, your experience has been different again. You've gone through some experiences that have allowed you to, I think, tick things off. So a number of different career paths.
It's very characteristic for me as well.
I mean, if we saw it on a spreadsheet, we'd really understand. But perhaps you could interpret what I'm saying a bit more in your own way.
We should have said at the beginning, there'll be time for questions at the end, so be thinking of anything that you might like to ask us. I grew up in a household of musicians. I was first and foremost a musician, violinist, but mainly singer. A couple of years of professional musicianship made it fairly clear to me that it wasn't really what I wanted to do. I did really very little art and design growing up because I was always in a practice room. I worked in healthcare for a number of years and was always on the lookout for something else. And I really just stumbled on metalwork. I stumbled into a jewellery evening course, and as soon as I'd never heard of silversmithing, I possibly shouldn't admit this. I didn't go to fairs. It just was a world that I wasn't aware of. And as soon as I learned that you could make objects as a way of understanding the world and as a way of exploring the world, I went back and I retrained. I went back as a mature student and have kind of built my practice from there, which possibly, I'm just keeping an eye on our time, leads us neatly onto what making means to us.
Okay. What does it take to make is possibly something that could be of help to understand where we come from and why we are interested where you come from. It's a sort of dialogue, it's the edge of our table to the world, and we are sitting on that table, metaphorically speaking. And there are different starting points. So you heard me showing you images that are what we see, what we look at, what are particular. And then you see the objects. Okay, you don't know who each of us was taking what kind of inspiration and photograph, but there is something about making that is related to what I call a good problem. And the good problem is that what could be also described with meaning. What kind of meaning or what kind of statement, we talked about that as well, making sense of the world through shape, do come to the fore in the planning, in the thinking about it. And I like to compare making a little bit like if you do a piece of text. It's a similar making. Text has the connotations of textile, a warp and a weft. So you have lines going that way and something weaves through it. Without that, the fabric couldn't hold together. And likewise with making a text, you need an intellectual understanding of an argument, and you weave through that some information, some statements, pros and cons. And I think this is a similar sort of thing that we have when we feel or think or work out a piece, that it has a structure, it has aspects that hold together. And I like to call them a good problem. So the good problem in my case could be a technical problem. It could be the juxtaposing the two things, talking to each other and conversing, or holding things together, or debating, is a spoon, and when does a spoon become a cup, and when is the handle of a spoon just the little finger that goes up and say, I'm here, listen to me. So making is really that profound that it is a statement. Only we now need to educate you that you read our pieces like you read the newspaper or you read an essay. And that is something whereby maybe it turns around, because with Instagram and all that, there are so many more images. And people start to become more literate in reading photographs or reading stuffness. In our case, that is important. The stuffness of all of our materials is in the main metal, but between us, we see our metal and finishes and the use very differently. So why do you use a linear surface?
For me, I'm going to go back slightly, if I may, to what you were saying about text. One of the things that really struck me when I first started making was I had originally studied literature and words, text. It's very malleable material. You can make words, as we have politically learned recently, you can make words do anything. You can shape them into any form and any argument that you want.
Wordsmithing.
Wordsmithing, exactly. When I first started making, it was an incredible leap for my mind that there were some things that physically you simply couldn't do, that the material would not go there, or if you made that form, you then couldn't get in to add another bit. And this, for me, has become a little bit of a theme and a motivation of my making. Someone once asked me to explain my practice in one sentence, and I had to go away and think about it. It's a very difficult thing to do, but I eventually came to the conclusion that I make objects to try and understand how the world fits together. And so for me, that interaction, that threshold that's between the intangible aspects of how we live in the world and the physical aspects of how we live in the world, understanding that join and that seam and that line and that boundary between those two things is really one of the main things that drives my work. So I think to answer your question about the linear finish, it's exactly that, it's the line. It's the line that you can tread, that you can walk, that takes you from one place to another. There's an interesting image up there to go with that. And I think that, for me, is one of the things that, that really drives my practice. I think I make and I use forms to try and understand how things fit together.
The thing that I've been thinking about in relation to Simone's question about why we make is because of the world, is to think about the world that we find ourselves in, the context in which we work. So you've already said we don't do 9 to 5. Well, we do, but not in a sort of conventional sense. We find ourselves in a sort of multifaceted world where we have to play a number of roles. And, at one stage in the year, we're in a place like this, talking to people like you, or as you've seen from the images, we might be in the workshops very much sort of focusing in on the actual work, or we might be writing about our work or about ourselves. We do a lot of different tasks, and in that there is a huge amount of freedom. I suppose the other thing that we haven't mentioned is the fact that we all have experiences of teaching or mentoring, and that's another facet of our world, isn't it? So we have to do what we do with a number of hats on, and that's a pleasure. That's a joy. It can be tough, but it's a choice, a lifestyle choice that we make.
But go a little bit back. How would you describe what is that what I say is my good problem? What is this sense of making meaning for you?
Well, yes, it's that thing of making sense of the world, for me, of taking information in from the world and reorganising it, using myself as a sort of conduit, I suppose, and then putting it out again, and then it goes on further, because once you put the work out to an audience like you're sort of requesting some sort of response or feedback that can influence what happens next. So it's a sort of ongoing process for me.
I think often jewellery and metal objects get put together, and I think we probably feel quite strongly that they're very different things and they're very different schools. One of the things for me about objects is they become holders for meaning. There is an American sociologist, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who speaks about the objects that we have around us becoming containers, holding things that hold for our experiences and our thoughts. And he talks about that our brains just aren't big enough to remember everything that we experience. And so we use objects as a proxy for memories of people, memories of family, memories of particular events, a holiday, or... and framed like that, objects, for me, become kind of loci, places in which communication can pool. And that happens through the making process, where we communicate with the metal to kind of form these objects. It happens then when we put these objects out for you to see, and it becomes then a conversation between you, the viewer, and the piece. And then when our pieces go to new homes, they then become a place in the fabric of somebody else's life, and become part of the meaning that they form with the objects they have around us. How would you say that relationship is framed for you?
What I agree with is that we all seem to have something about container. Now that is the question whether metalwork, by its definition, is something that holds things particularly good together, to the point that it could be watertight, or to the point that it is just a loose gathering, or a frame, or just a frame on a table and nothing can roll off. But with all of us, there's also that debate when something is really highly purposeful, and then that moment where it just doesn't work, and it wasn't set out to work. And this making sense of the world manifests itself maybe through this debate that we put out there. Do you think what we make is useful? Do you, and when we watch you as much as you watch us, we watch you as well, and we try to read what's going on. What do you think? We may get that wrong, but it's interesting to see that. And that debate of, is it purposeful? Can you use it? How would you use it? And then when it goes into people's hand, the next layer is really fascinating, because metal is it's a tough material. It's, you know, Rebecca was, Juliette was talking about that it could sing, or that it's sloppy and leaves its clothes behind. Metal could be also quite a bitch. You could not move a dog sitting inside and you want to take it out. So it is quite stubborn. But it also is fragile and it's susceptible. I had once a piece where someone just put their hands over it and then left them up. So that interaction, that we put one layer on and you put the next layers on, that is possibly something that allows you to take ownership over it. Should we go and ask whether there are some questions? Because now you've seen more than the pieces there, you have seen a selection of images, and you have had some of our thoughts why we make, and what does it mean to make, and how do we try to install meaning into pieces, into work. Otherwise, I would recommend come and find us back on the table. Ah, sorry, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it works. Now it works. I ask all the three of you, do you follow like single projects that you kind of realize, and then you stop at one point and start the next project, or is it like a continuous process?
In the making.
Yeah, in the making, and from one piece to the next, it's kind of developing something, and like in 10 years it looks different 10 years ago, yeah. Or is it you kind of follow one project and after a certain time you just quit it and go to the next one?
I start because I'm the longest one in the tooth. Work making regards. For me, there's a process of learning. So each piece gives me some feedback. It talks back, although you might think metal doesn't talk, but it's the experience, it's the deduction you also make out of it. And so I quite often work on more than one project because I can't hold the intention to just one conversation. But there is something that goes in circles as well. I find myself not quite as a one-track pony, but certain thematics come back. They fascinate me. And I find out when I go and re-debate them years later that the debate takes a very different turn and it expresses itself in a very different way. So there is another understanding maybe about the project, and that goes possibly for all of us. Most of us not only work in our workshop, so when I teach, that is a project in its own right, and I come to the teaching very much as a maker. But then I also have this here, Project Metal, as a project. And then I work also, when I work with a gallery, that's a different project, that is a different encounter and a different interaction. Or I do another project with a potter, Juliette Bigley, and that is a completely different engagement or encounter between making and making sense.
I think for me there are certain kind of practical projects. So you might be working with a curator towards an exhibition and you've agreed and developed together a body of work that has to be delivered on a certain date at a certain time in a certain format. So those practical things, those practical deadlines, which are very helpful, will shape how what you're working on. There is also that idea that what I learned from this piece, I think, oh, that particular bit, that particular corner of that piece, I really like that. What happens if I take that corner over here? And so they're like footprints in the sand. You know, you can see backwards, and you can see the relationship between things. And I think that with most makers, you can see a voice. So even if their work 10 years ago was very different, I think you can usually look at it and say, oh, that's a Rebecca de Quin piece, or there's a certain character in there, I think, that tends to underpin people's work.
Yes, and it's a sort of an inevitable thing, isn't it? It's not something you can stop.
No.
But this, in answer to your question, for me it's a very kind of complicated thing. It depends on what's going on externally, as Juliette says, what exhibitions are coming up and so on. But if I look beyond that, what often drives my work is interest in particular processes. So for instance, I've at times been very interested in the scoring process, which is the means by which you weaken metal in order to be able to fold it rather like paper. And that's taken me along certain sort of paths just to see what I can do with that technique. And then later on, pattern making textures in sheet material using punches has led me to, it's been a sort of theme through a number of different pieces of work. But then these things have actually also become quite circular for me. So I started with a real interest in patination and then left it for a long time and made a lot of work in silver. And now I'm returning to my interest in patination again, revisiting it with new enthusiasm. So that's very nice. I appreciate what you say about when you make a piece something that you learn, then it becomes a reason for going on to something else. There's also perhaps things about aspects of form, making forms, that you produce something and then think, I would like to try that again, but slightly differently. So sometimes things can look more similar. So you might have a number of pieces that appear to be a series, and they are, because you're exploring
a variation of a theme.
Yes, and then there might be something that's a complete switch, but the link could be the colouring process or the way you soldered it together.
I think there is possibly one other aspect, which is the sort of deep dive, where you say, right, here's a project I want to tackle, and it might be a technical project, it might be a more kind of philosophical body of research that then informs your pieces. That's the artist's luxury. If you can, I think, find the time either through a residency or through, further study, that's the kind of the thing I think that we would all love to indulge ourselves in.
Yeah, that would be delightful. Yes.
Any other questions? Excellent, we have a couple.
Have you experienced maybe in your biography, if you look back, kind of a breaking point where you create something which helps you to reinterpret what you have done before in a new way, in a new framework, and then you can kind of go beyond that and see the world a little bit different?
The notion of reflection, I think, is really a crucial part, and I think that comes more through the English education system, the teaching and focusing students to not only read their own work, but to articulate and read what they see in other people's work. So reflection is helpful, and there are certain tools that you can set out for yourself a number of questions, 2 or 3, that you go through a number of pieces, and that makes a lot of sense, and that makes then answering a forward question more easily. It's a method, it's a structure.
I think for me, certain pieces are kind of breakthrough pieces where you do something that's been very different from something you've done before, or that takes you in a very new direction, opens a new door. And I think that then contrasts with the idea of a spiral, where you'll come back to a similar place, but from a different perspective. Often and hopefully at a deeper level, but always from a different view. And I think, Simone, what you said about reflection is absolutely key, to be able to do, and to do a lot, and then put it, and to stand back. And you almost do it with a different brain. You need a gap between those two things. It was very interesting recently for an application. I was pulling together work from even as recently as 18 months ago, and it looked so different to me now. And it was almost quite a shock that work from, I mean, it's very clearly still my work. You would, I think, see that it's my work, but my perspective on it has changed so much in that time. And that was, it was very interesting. It was a bit of a shock.
The thing I'm thinking about in answer to this question is sort of age and experience. That as I find as I go on with my work and produce more and more, I'm able to feel more confident about the way I work and confident in making decisions to perhaps change direction and follow a different theme. And that's great. It's lovely to have that sort of freedom and to be able to look back on what's gone before and maybe think about picking something else up from the past. Yeah, there's a certain sort of, you start to feel comfortable in your own creative skin, I think, and able to direct yourself better. I remember a time in my career when I always felt slightly kind of panicked about whether I was doing the right thing and extremely influenced by the external world, which probably led me to make some things that I wasn't entirely comfortable with, things that I felt commercially I ought to be making because they would be the things that would sell. Nowadays I feel more able to make the things that I want to make, that I really believe in myself and enjoy.
Well, this is a question you won't appreciate. It is interesting that you're 5 women metalsmiths. Looking at your work, certainly I think the 3 of you, many people would see it as it's very architectural and often interpreted as masculine. Why do you think, in terms of leading silversmiths, and I think you are leading silversmiths worldwide, that it's the women who've actually done something so very different and so powerful?
That really is a difficult question, thank you. Anyone?
Well, I think there are some rather unpalatable answers to that, actually. I think maybe for women working in this sort of field, or perhaps in the crafts, can fit in quite comfortably with your way of life. It can...
The domestic.
Yes. And being a mother, it can work quite well because it can be flexible in terms of the hours you put in, and it can work quite well sometimes with a partner who has a more sort of regular income. Income in this field can be it can ebb and flow. So in some instances, I think women have found themselves in a position of being able to fit in with a more conventional lifestyle of a partner. But I think there are other things too, that as women we feel that we have every right to compete in a more masculine world perhaps, and that we shouldn't feel that we need to make work that has a sort of
conforms.
Yeah, that conforms to a feminine.
And actually I think all that doesn't come to the before, when I'm in the workshop, I don't know whether what I am, who I am, whatever. I'm just making. That's the first notion. My hands go possibly sometimes in front of my brain, and then my brain tries to catch up with my hands, and I'm all the extension of a tool, or the extension of an idea, or the extension of the desire wanting to see the end of it. But that sort of, yeah, I know there is a heart ticking, but and the brain going and everything else, but it's totally gender neutral for me.
Yeah, so it's sort of, it comes out. So I don't know if we could do it any other way, actually, could we?
I think maybe it's very easy to frame things in terms of gender. I think the interesting question for me is having had the training, the skills, and the courage, big word, to say, does it have to be this way? What happens if we ask this question this way instead of that way? And there are certain choices you make as an artist. It's been very interesting for me coming to this later. You do get the choice. Do I want to make more commercial work which is easier to sell, or do I want to make my work? For me, that was a very easy choice because I left a good career in healthcare. And why would I give up that, which I enjoyed enormously? Why would I give up that to make work that just doesn't satisfy me personally? There's no logic in that, there's no point in that. So I feel very lucky that I have been challenged and enabled and trained and helped to hopefully be able to be true to the making self that I've encountered along the way, which I think is very similar to what you were saying, Simone.
There's also, Corinne, there's also something else I think to be said in answer to this question. If you go back a bit in time, think back to the sort of 70s when there was a big sort of change in the jewellery movement. Women started to make jewellery because, as I was saying before, it fitted in well with being a wife and mother and perhaps working from home. They started to work with sort of unconventional materials from the kitchen table, and then maybe following on from that, a sort of return to the more traditional materials, metals, and then our experiences in terms of our art school training would have given us the opportunity to perhaps start working small on more of a jewellery scale with these materials like metal. And once you start on a small scale with the material, there's sort of nothing to stop you going bigger. And it's something that it's a discovery that you can make. Well, I could go bigger. If you're starting small, you can't necessarily go smaller, but you can very easily go bigger. So I think what I'm trying to say is there's a kind of natural evolution, and it's arrived at this point where we three women are perhaps, or hopefully, inspiration to younger women to work with metal on the sort of scale that we work with it on. There's also this idea of kind of off the body, on the body, off the body.
And the different notion if you wear something or carry something.
Still body related.
Yeah, and how it interacts with it. You hold a bowl, or you caress a bowl, or you carry a bowl, and eventually you let go. And the same happens with jewelry, but that letting go is a different notion or placing.
So we've all probably made those choices for ourselves about working off the body, away from the body, not following that path of sort of body adornment, but thinking more about our surroundings and use the sort of
and I just simply like to put something into the piece that is not related to one particular person. But any one person can go and make a different meaning out of it, a different spin on a different story, read it wrong from, or different, very different from how I would see it, or what I try to install into it.
For me personally, I really hate working on small things. It really hurts your hands and it's really fiddly.
Yes.
I wasn't actually asking about this, and I think you alluded taken it as being small and kind of big. Well, like, you know, it's kind of much more to me the fact that, in a sense, that you all have been slightly on the margin. And because you're on the margin, in a way, Juliette, you've said it, you can ask questions and you've challenged orthodoxies. And I suspect, though I'm not sure you want to admit that, it's because it has traditionally been a slightly excluding field, metalwork, that as women coming into it, you've kind of said, okay, well, what can we do and why should we go for other people's stereotypes?
Yeah. I think it's been an exclusive world in terms of industry, but as the silver industry in particular in the UK, but as that has sort of broken down, there have been more possibilities for people like us to work on our own in a more artistic way, so less production, more closer to artists.
Yeah, I think that we don't necessarily see ourselves within the very traditional confines of metalsmithing, and within the UK, because of the setup of various institutions, metalsmithing historically has had a certain shape. Simone, you quote, I can't remember who it is, but going beyond the bounds.
Michael Rowe, he says that he goes beyond the borders into the territory of fine art in order to report back. And this reporting back, in his case, relates to the craft and to an understanding of working with metal. I think this would be possibly, unless there's someone really having another question, a good time to end. And if you have more questions, come to our stand. Have a look, talk to us, get a feel, touch the stuff, and we're looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this beautiful and interesting talk. We have a small present also for you. It's not metal, it's in papier-mâché, but it's handmade from Japan. And it's a wish bringer in Japan. You have to fill out one eye, you wish something, and
Das Gespräch mit
true,
Contemporary Ceramics Belgium beginnt in 5 Minuten auf Stand.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Toast Contemporary Ceramics Belgium talk on stand B11 starts in 5 minutes.
Ich möchte noch kurz einen Hinweis machen auf das nächste Gespräch, das letzte dieser Tresor, die wir hier haben. Das wird ein Gespräch sein mit John A. Caminada, Architekt, und Kurt Eschbacher, den wir sehr gut aus dem Schweizer Fernsehen kennen, und das wird sicher auch sehr spannend und ich würde mich sehr freuen, Sie alle wieder zu begrüßen.